Hello, everyone. I'm Nazleen with the Global Good Fund, and I'll be facilitating today's session. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be discussing or hearing from a PR expert about how to communicate during times of crisis, which is what we are all facing right now. Just to give you a sense of how the session today will go, we will have presentation for about 20 minutes. And then after that, we will go into a Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. Please click that and feel free to add any questions that you have. During the presentation is fine. You don't need to wait until the end. We hope that this will be a really lively and interactive discussion. We hope that we'll be able to do this for about an hour. So with that, I am delighted to introduce our panelists for today. We have Nell Callahan, who is the founder of Frontwood Strategies. She is a PR expert who has worked on many different campaigns, including the presidential campaign for the Kerry Edwards team in 2004. She also has worked at the US Senate and has worked on a lot of major advocacy campaigns. So with that, I pass it on to Nell. Nell, welcome.
Thanks, Nazleen, and thank you everybody for joining today. I'm excited to help you through this moment in time. As Nazleen mentioned, I am a communications consultant, and I've worked on the front lines of crises that you've unfortunately heard about and read about over the years. And so I'll be bringing to bear that experience today. So we're going to go through, this presentation is in 5 major parts. First is understanding what a crisis is and defining it so we're working from a common definition. Second, talking through the principles of crisis communications, and these elements will help guide you through any moment, whether it's the one that we're in now or crises that you anticipate in the future. I'm going to talk through a case study from a small business that I work with. So then you can see how all these principles can come together, especially in the context of the pandemic and the economic downturn. Then we're going to talk about planning for the future. We're in the midst of a crisis now, but the unfortunate reality is that there will always be threats to your organization. So I'm going to give you the tools to start to think through those. And then, of course, I'll answer whatever questions you have. So let's get started here. So what is a crisis? The word is often thrown around too casually, in my opinion. A crisis is not a bad day. It's not a singular bad story. It's something that has a serious and lasting impact on your ability to do business. So what do I mean by that? So it's something where you would fundamentally lose the trust of your customers, investors, or employees. We've seen this in the tech industry recently, where, several years ago, there were many tech brands that were considered disruptors, but now their employees are taking a stand saying that their practices are predatory, or their customers are saying that their business models are against their values. Those I would qualify as a crisis. Financial issues are obviously a crisis. So losing a major contract that would precipitate job loss, that's a crisis. If your stock price is falling, that's a crisis. We've seen in local ordinances being changed that would constitute a crisis. So, for example, in many cities, city councils and mayors are changing the laws so that things like e-scooters and Airbnb are no longer, or it makes it more challenging for them to operate. They would constitute those as a crisis. Of course, litigation is a crisis, which that can range anything from a personal legal issue that's contrary to your brand to financial fraud or lawsuits that are about your business and your business practices. Throughout the presentation, I will refer to different examples of crises, but I just wanted to start to get you thinking about what a crisis is and how they manifest themselves beyond just the moment that we're in today. So a lot of these things are probably already keeping you up at night. So the good thing I'm here to say is that you can be prepared, and that this discussion today will help you think through those concerning moments in a productive way, so then you can get through to the other side. So one thing though, before I get into the particulars, is very rarely does communications solve the crisis itself. A good crisis communications plan is always paired with a good operational or legal strategy. So do not make decisions about crisis communications in a vacuum. You need a team, you need experts, and you need to think about what you're going to do, not just what you're going to say. So this plan, this discussion should be embraced with that mindset. What makes a good plan? So you need to have a team, which we'll talk about later. And we already know that crisis will manifest themselves differently. But what we're going to do is talk through these 7 principles and what they mean and how you apply them. So being goal-oriented, being timely, being clear, being inclusive, and being intentional, being authentic, and being accessible will be your pathway out of the crisis. So diving more deeply into this, it's important to set a goal at the beginning during this planning stage and ask yourself and your advisors, what is a reasonable outcome for the circumstance? This thinking through what the outcome could be will be your North Star as you think through the strategy, what tactics you decide to deploy, and assessing whether or not the crisis is actually over. One of my clients was a trade association for a major form of transportation. And so we determined as we were planning creating our crisis plan, that an accident in our industry would necessitate news coverage, right? There would always be news coverage of an accident. But what we could do as a trade association and what we would set our goals and strategy around is making sure that regulators and legislators and stakeholders and the media were aware of all of the safety steps and precautions that we had taken, so that any coverage of an accident was paired with the knowledge that we were doing everything we possibly could to keep people safe. So those are the types of goals that you can set where it's something that is reasonable, but outcomes driven. Second, being timely. Framing is a fundamental communication strategy. So communicating early and often is essential. It shows that you have your audience's best interest in mind, but it also helps you define what process should be taking place and how events should unfold. So you must balance this urge to be timely and to communicate early with not getting out ahead of yourself. So you have no leeway in a crisis to make a mistake. And so you cannot make promises that you cannot keep. So you have to sort of balance this urge to be quick with the urge to be right and accurate. So finally, being clear is essential. You have to have the same message across every channel with like obvious modifications for the audience. So like if you're sending an email to employees, like the guts of it are probably the same as what you post on social media, but you'd obviously talk to your employees a little bit different than the public at large. So the other part about being clear is using simple and direct language. Avoid the urge to use jargon, particularly legal jargon, because you want to make sure that people know your intentions. You want to be approachable, and you don't want to create any confusion or room for interpretation. So I try to purge jargon from everything that I do, but it is particularly important in the times of crisis. Okay, so being inclusive, you really need to think about your audiences and who's the most important to you. So typically this is your employees, your board of directors, your customers. There's longer lists depending on who how you run your business, the structure of it, but think about all those people and then how you reach all those people, because you can't leave anyone out, right? Then that goes hand in hand with being intentional as you think about who those people are. Who needs to hear from you, the CEO, directly? Who needs a phone call? Who needs a personal email? Who can be contacted through your email list or your website or social media? Making sure that those questions are asked and you have the priority set will be essential in making sure that you're retaining or regaining trust with the people that you care about most. Be authentic. This is really important. And we've all seen examples of this not working and some examples of it working pretty well. So the first thing is, if the crisis is your fault, apologize, right? There is a saying in crisis communications, mess up, fess up, dress up, right? So the fess up is important, especially if it's your fault. So you need to, one example that came to mind is Starbucks. They had racist incidents in their cafes in, I think, Philadelphia a year or so ago. And they not only apologized, but they took operational steps, which was closing all of their cafes for a day of training for all of their staff, so that they could regain that trust and show that they had really learned from the experience and were moving on to do business differently. I think that's a good best practice. And then the other is empathy. So there are things that will happen to your business, the moment that we're in now, hurricanes, fires, other things that are outside of your control, but things that you'll be expected to talk about and will constitute a crisis for your business. Demonstrate how you're prepared for those instances, show empathy to the people that are affected, and that will help you build trust and, from your audiences. Finally, be accessible, I think, is really important. Ask for and accept feedback. So this could be really simple, at the end of an email, giving people the opportunity to email you with their thoughts or their feelings, right? Or if it's something that's for your employees, you could have a town hall with your employees and answer their questions. I think there's sometimes a reticence for leaders to be put in front of like a firing squad, but in the end, if you're prepared, it really goes a long way in building your credibility and your trust. So we can talk about that more specifically, but there will be a range of emotions that are stirred up in times of crisis, and good leadership is making sure that you can receive and manage that range of emotions. So those are our 7 principles. So being goal-oriented, being timely, being clear, being inclusive, being intentional, being authentic, and being accessible. So you have your principles. Now let's think about how that crisis unfolds, right? So there is an incident that kicks off the timeline. So you're either informed of it, right? Depending on, so that could be a lawsuit being filed, that could be someone slipping and falling in your retail space, that could be a government agency issuing guidance, right? So during that time, you need to evaluate the facts at hand. You need to dust off your crisis communications plan. Hopefully it's not too dusty. And look at your goals, reset them, make sure that they're on point. And then you need to begin to formulate your response. Then there is a period in which you are executing that plan. So that is drafting your materials, relaying information, monitoring and assessing how the situation is unfolding. And then the crisis ends when you've returned to your operating normal, or you've defined a new operating normal, right? Because as we know, all crises can change us and change our organizations. So that's when I mark the end of the crisis, right? So that could be when your stock price goes back up, or when your revenue, it returns to where it was. And all of this could take 24 hours. It could take a year or it could take years, right? So the example of if that I look at for corporate that I thought of in this timeline was Theranos, which one of the most shocking corporate crises in recent times, right? And I went back to look at the timeline. The first story that reported that their product did not work was in late 2015, right? And the legal action is not resolved at all. So this is years later, and it will continue to be ongoing. So, and I think as you think about the current circumstances and how the economic downturn will affect your business, I think that we don't know what the depth of the economic crisis will be yet. So it could be quite some time depending on how you're defining the crisis and your organization. Okay, so I'm going to talk through the case study of an organization called Concord Seminars. So you can see how all of this can come together. So Concord Seminars is a small business that offers continuing education to dentists and dental hygienists. So their business is pretty niche, but the lessons here can be applied to pretty much any organization of size and scale and function. So before March 2020, Concord Seminars made 100% of their revenues from in-person meetings that were scheduled all over the country. And as I said, they do continuing education for dental and dental hygienists. So basically, in order to keep your license, you have to attend one of these seminars for credit. So the Concord Seminars communicated with their audience largely by mail. So you'd get a postcard in the mail about the seminar in your community, and you would mail back a postcard with the check, your registration fee, and then you would show up, right? So in early March, as leading organizations like the NBA and others were starting to cancel large events to slow the spread of COVID-19, the Concord Seminars team took notice and began to think about what that meant for their organization. And so as of March 13th, they had 18 meetings scheduled that had more than 50 attendees each, and they're scattered all over the country. And that was the same day that the CDC issued guidance banning gatherings of 50 or more people for the next 60 days. So this action by the CDC put their business at risk, right? That was how they made their money, and they were looking at having no income and having to potentially issue refunds for at least 2 months, right? So what would you do in this circumstance? You might have been faced with the same exact scenario, depending on your business. So, knowing what we know about crisis communications, thinking through the pandemic and the operational changes that you would need to make, what would you do? How would you connect with your audiences? What would you say to your employees that might be also doing the math of wait, if we have no revenue, what does that mean for me? I think I was saying to Rob and Nesleen before this that doing these presentations is bittersweet because I get to meet a lot of new people, but often in their worst moments. The good thing I think about crises are that you have the opportunity to be the leader you want to see. So how would you take care of your people, however you define that best? So what Concord Seminars did was they put the safety of their customers first, and they canceled all of their meetings, and they used email to do it. And so their email stated that that all their seminars would be rebooked at a later date and to stay tuned for more information. And then they offered a credit to their customers for 2 years for an in-person session or a full refund. So this generated swift backlash from their customers because they need their credit to maintain their license, to therefore maintain their own businesses. And so the Concord got a much higher call and email volume than they usually are equipped to handle. But they stood by their decision, and so they allocated additional staff time to to customer service so that they can maintain a dialogue with their customers that they have never really had before, since they only like mailed them things and never really talked to them except in person at the actual seminars. So as they were handling this incoming, they got to work on a parallel track, figuring out how to convert their product to a digital offering. And so they identified a technology platform that suited their needs, and they quickly trained their staff on how to use it and deploy it. So 11 days after the CDC guidance was issued, they launched this new business stream. Customers were alerted to the online option, and they restated the option of applying their previous registration credits for several webinars to apply it to a future in-person session or to have a full refund. So the crisis is not yet over. They, understanding that this was the first time that many of their customers were going to engage with an online learning platform, they increased their customer service infrastructure around the first several webinars, which they had more than 400 people slated to attend, which blew the attendance numbers from their in-person sessions out of the water, right? Because they now had a single gathering place for people. So they have surveyed people post this first wave of online offerings, and their customers actually prefer online learning now. I think thanks in large part to their enhanced customer service. And they also now they've turned this into an opportunity because they now have an active and engaged email list, which in the end will save them money in marketing in the future, because they now no longer have to mail people or mail nearly as many things to people. And they, by developing this business stream and shoring up their revenue, they've now defined the end of the crisis for themselves, right? They have a more efficient platform to disseminate their product, and they're making their money back essentially. So I want to dive deeper into their communications tools. So I think thinking about communication is not just email, it's not just your website, it's also that customer service function where your clients are turning to and your staff can relay information. So by enhancing that customer service function, they were able to make sure that they got through the crisis, where we've all had the experience of trying to call customer service and no one answers the phone, or you don't get an answer or the help that you need, and you get frustrated and you walk away from that business as as something where you want to shop or spend your time or money. But they were able to do that by spending the right time. They also, I want to draw attention to their handling of cancellations. They empowered their customers to make choices. They didn't tell people what they would do with their money. They said, hey, you can rebook because we know that you like our, or you can ask for your money. And then you could still hold on to that registration for an in-person offering. When we do have it, you can ask for your money back again. Have issued some refunds, but not nearly to the degree in which they thought they might on say March. Just to restate what I said at the beginning here, they have a pretty niche audience and they deliver a very specific thing, but the challenge couldn't be greater. Their whole business is at risk by the CDC guidance. And so I think what we can take away from this is that not only did they have a communications plan that communicated their intentions, their values, and what action that they and their customers can be taking, but they changed their operations as well to rise to the occasion. Okay, so here's a little bit and think about you and how to put all of this to work. At the end of this, when you get your evaluation from Nasleen, you'll also be getting a worksheet that will help you through these steps. And you can use it as a template for building out your crisis communications plan in the future. So we're going to start by thinking about the bad news is that we're still in a crisis here, and I look forward to answering your questions about things that are happening now. But unfortunately, there are going to be more in the future. But this plan will help you get through them, and we can think through and anticipate what the challenges ahead might be. So the first step in planning is inventorying foreseeable scenarios, and I've included some big topics here that to help organize your thoughts. So I usually come up with these range of topics, and they can shift importance and if you need them based on the structure of your business, and then I put subcategories under each. So just to dive deeper and give you some examples. So under financial crises, I would include layoffs and furloughs. I would also include financial crimes or mismanagement like fraud or embezzlement or the misuse of funds. Under operational, this is particularly important if you have a retail or office space. So this could be anything from like a slip and fall or a workplace injury. Reputational issues are basically these are things that are counter to your brand. So for example, we've seen many progressive brands or like women-led organizations where it's come out that they're hostile workplaces or have poor policies that are counter to what their brand is supposed to be all about. Or we've seen companies release products that are racist or racially insensitive, like H&M, I think is a really good example. They've had a bunch of t-shirts and sweatshirts that they put out that have racist sentiments on it. So those would fall in the reputational category. Cybersecurity, if you're not thinking about this, you really need to be. Everyone is at risk of being hacked these days. And so cybersecurity has two sides of it. Is it your customer data that's breached, or is it your intellectual property that's breached? So a lot of my friends worked at the DNC, and their emails are all published on the internet. So how would that happen for your organization, and what can you do about it? What's the risk? Employee related. So there's like a wide range of things that could happen here. I work with a lot of education clients. So we've all unfortunately seen headlines of teachers having inappropriate relationships with students. That would fall under employee related if I was writing the plan. Or there's like less severe things in this category, of course, like a negative customer service experience that your employee is at the center of. So we've seen like the Starbucks example. We've seen like airlines having issues with this where they where customers are treated poorly, and it's all like filmed on someone's phone and then put on the internet, right? Leadership transitions. Hopefully you're planning for this and like this is not a surprise, but like if something happens to you or someone that is integral to your organization, you should have something on paper. And then of course there's many different acts of God, like whether it's like a hurricane or a tornado or a fire, or pandemic that you should think through. And that these are highly dependent on like where you do business and how you do business, right? So if you're in Florida, you probably already have a hurricane plan, but make sure you have the communications component of that. And then also legal and regulatory issues. There is like a wide range of things that could happen here, and it really depends on the structure of your business and what type of work you do and how heavily regulated it is. We also there are some industries that are more litigious than others. So thinking through that. So now that you are freaking out about all the bad things that could possibly happen to your organization, let's try to find some clarity, okay? So the next step is identifying your team, and then defining a decision-making process. So you really need to do these things before your crisis happens. So then you're thinking clearly And that particularly applies to the decision-making process. So under each category, you should have a different team. For a small organization, I recognize that that might not happen, but at a larger organization, there are different expertise that you can draw on that might be spread out through different people in your organization. So typically a crisis response team is your executive team, but it might also need to include someone like your communications team, so then they can help you think through the public-facing dynamic of it and writing the materials. It might also need to include someone from your IT team, like particularly under the cybersecurity thing. That might be someone outside of your organization that can help you with the tech infrastructure, or it might be someone who you might need to include, like your webmaster or the IT guy who or gal who updates your website or helps you disseminate information. So it might not necessarily just be folks in the C-suite. I highly recommend it be a small group of people, so then decision making and processes are quick, and that everyone at the table is contributing something. So think through who's on your squad. And then the next most important thing about your team is making sure that they know that they are on the crisis team, and that they know what the plan is and that they're part of it, so that it's not a surprise to them when something happens. Okay, now how do these people all work together? We talked a little bit about the timeline, but there needs to be a process to decide things and to learn about the facts at hand. And it needs to be clear, and it needs to be pretty disciplined. So how I always think about it is that there's a notice of an incident. That could be someone inside your organization, like generally like your legal counsel's office, or like your operations team might be the people that say, hey, something bad has happened in our factory. Here's the facts at hand, right? So you're notified of the incident, and then the crisis team should be alerted, and you should connect pretty quickly about what's happening, what the possible implications are, and what needs to happen next. So usually there's a period of monitoring and information collecting that happens. So that can mean anything from evaluating, like, what are the chances that this spills over into the public? What do we need to tell our customers? What do we need to tell our employees? What do we need to alert the board of directors to? Is this really a crisis, or is it a singular thing that can be worked out in a one-to-one customer service type scenario? So you should divide those assignments and set a deadline so that you have the information you need to make a decision, but that you're doing it in a timely fashion. And then what I typically do is regroup and determine what that final strategy is, and assign what the next steps in the plan are. So in many scenarios, I basically, once we have we're notified of the incident, we have about an hour to collect the information, and we regroup as a crisis team. We talk through it and what the implications are, and someone is assigned the job of monitoring. Someone is assigned the task of drafting materials under what that reflect the scenario that we think is most likely, and that someone is probably gathering more information. And then we set a new time to regroup, which might be another hour or several hours later. As we determine if a plan is necessary to be executed, then it's clear who is doing what, when, and that we are regrouping and continuously sharing information so there are no blind spots. And then, of course, someone needs to monitor, and we need to continually have that touch point of, is this over? Do we need to continue to monitor? Are we through this crisis? What do we need to do next? So even in organizations where the chain of command and responsibilities are very clear, having this process on paper as part of your crisis plan is really helpful, because in a moment of crisis, people forget things, or there's a lot of things happening. Like, I think the current moment is a great example where this isn't just a crisis for work, it's a crisis in people's home lives as well. So making sure that you're providing as much clarity on what you expect from your team is essential for things to go well. Okay, and now we get into more detail of determining the plan. So as you'll see on the worksheet, under each category, you should be setting a goal. You should be determining what audiences you need to communicate in this foreseen series of events and how you communicate with them. It's helpful to have the facts that you can anticipate needing on hand. So for example, if you if there's going to be a factory that might close, understanding what your company's footprint is totally is a useful set of facts to have just in that plan or quickly link to that fact page on your website. Drafting the core messaging around any scenario is helpful. How I like to think about it is like, if you have an introduction that's sort of, if most of these communications will probably go out by email. So if you think about it as like an introductory paragraph that frames up the situation, the middle paragraph laying out your steps forward, and then that third paragraph being your feedback and how people can reach you and share their thoughts. Write that middle paragraph as best you can, because the top and the bottom will probably change depending on the scenario. And then inventory what assets you already have. So I keep going back to safety, but like, is there a safety page on your website? You'll probably need to update it. So you should link to it in the plan so you don't forget to update that safety page, because it might create confusion if you have competing pieces of information out there. Or is there, I think we see right now a lot of people are using pop-ups on their website to channel people's energies. I have been buying my groceries online, and so if you go to many grocery store websites right now, if their customer service process pops up and their guidance that they have for how to place an order and get what you need. So thinking about how you can use those tools now is really helpful. So then you're not scrambling in the moment when your timeline is condensed. The other thing, so to give you another example, one of my clients, they relied really heavily on the phone because they worked in basically a situation where no one was sitting at a desk and there wasn't a lot of internet access. And so we had a robocalling vendor vetted and like essentially set up so that if something bad was to happen, then we could push information by phone to all of their employees. And we would always, thinking about an email that goes out to folks, we also wrote a call script. So having something like that call vendor as part of your assets is something that takes time. So you should do it now if that is something that would help your company. Okay, so that is how we hope. Hopefully, you're jotting down notes as we go. But beyond the session, so continue to brainstorm those scenarios. Focus your time on building out the plan on what you think is going to happen, what's most likely to happen, right? Make sure your team is in place and begin drafting those materials so your turnaround time is that much shorter. And then make sure that you revisit this plan. I recommend every 6 months to a year so that you are adapting it based on your business and the environment in which you're working, because this type of work takes a lot of time and you want the plan to be useful, right? You need it. Like, you need to be able to maintain that trust with your audience and your employees. But if you spend time working on it, make sure that you work to maintain it so then it's truly helpful to you. Thank you so much. Nazaleen, I'm happy to take people's questions for as much time as we have today.
Thank you so much, Nell. That was a wealth of information and a lot of actionable things that people can implement immediately. So just encouraging people to post their questions in the Q&A section. So we have a few questions that have come in. And one of them is, it takes time to put together a plan. You know, you've really shared a lot of detailed information with that. But this particular person does not have the time to do that, nor the staff. So can you please share what the absolute minimum one should be doing at this time?
Sure. So I think in the minimum, I would think about the challenges that are most likely to happen soonest, right? So right now, the pandemic is ongoing. The economy is continuing to falter. So what are the next things that could happen in your business now or in the next year or two? So if you've been able to maintain your staff, but at some point you're not going to be able to keep them on anymore, I would start to think through that. Or if there are other challenges that you will face in the coming years, I would start with those materials. It does take a lot of time to plan, but it will help you in the long run. So I know it's probably seems unrealistic, but even if you step away from your computer for an hour and jot down the things that you think are most likely to happen and who you would have on your team to help you through them, it will put you in a better place than you currently are if you don't have anything down on paper.
The next question is, what is the biggest mistake people make in a crisis?
I think that the biggest mistake that people make is that they make promises that they can't keep, right? Like there's a rush to, so I think they fall in a couple categories. They make promises they can't keep, so they come out too quickly and they say something that they can't actually do. I think this particularly happens in like in an environmental disaster, right? Like, which might not be totally applicable to our folks on the phone here, but there are versions of that, right? Like telling your customers that we'll be back the same way as before, but you've not actually figured out how to do that. That's a problem, right? Because if you can't keep that promise, then you're further eroding trust. Or like with your employees, if you're saying that you're going to do one thing, but there's like no way you can operationally do that, you've broken their trust, and your employees are the most important people to making your business successful. I think the other thing that we see, and this is not necessarily a communications problem, but it's a failure of leadership where people don't want to apologize, or they're not, they don't, some of these crises are not your fault, but being empathetic, I think, is important. Or apologizing is really hard for some people, but making sure that you do it, I think, is really essential and human. So, I mean, an example of that is, I ordered coffee from a local coffee roaster here in Washington, and I recommended them to a friend, and my friend said, "Oh, they laid off 90% of their staff the first day of the crisis. Should you really be buying their coffee?" And so I was like, oh my gosh, am I not shopping with my values? And so I looked online, and they said nothing anywhere about their business decisions, right? So as like a slightly more informed customer, because I like live this, I asked myself, I was like, are they just not good at business? And like, of course, like if their coffee shops aren't open, of course they can't pay their employees and they've not planned for this. Or did they just not communicate that like what they could pay their people is less than what they can make if they file for unemployment? But I don't know. Like, I don't know. So I might not buy their coffee again, right? So being empathetic, it's something really small, but like being empathetic can come, has a real impact.
So the next question sort of is a follow-up from some of the examples that you gave, with Theranos and, with Starbucks. And the examples were, sort of Starbucks, reacted positively and, was fast and sort of did it right, while Theranos, don't know if the crisis is over. So the question really is, how do you know when a crisis is over that you're facing?
Right. So it's hard as an outsider to answer this question, but I think it is based on a couple of different things. One is revenue, of course. So like if you take a hit financially, when are you back to where you were? Two, like larger organizations do polling, right? Reputational polling to see how people, especially if their brand is something that people are aware of, to figure out what people actually think of them. That's not an option for small businesses, but there are ways that you can, that are a proxy for public opinion. So like, how is your social media going? Like, do you have more engagement? Is your audience growing? Are you seeing new customers from new places, right? So I think that there are a couple ways where a crisis can manifest themselves, and then you can see what the inverse is. So if it has to do with your employment practices, are you having an easier time retaining people once you make the operational change and you change the way you communicate? Or are you continuing to see bad reviews on a place like Glassdoor or something like that? There are proxies for opinion that you can identify depending on what the impact of the crisis could be.
So the next question is from someone who says they don't have a communications expert within their staff, nor do they have the resources to pay for one. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations on where one can get communications expertise?
Yeah, so I think that there are thinking through like who writes your emails. Like part of it is, how do you communicate with people already, and making sure that you're just working ahead on some of these things. I think there are resources online about crisis communications practices or marketing or PR that you could use. I'm always happy to collaborate with people if you are in the midst of something or want to think through something in advance. But I would find your best writer and most strategic thinker to help you in a pinch if you can't add resources to your team.
Thank you. So the last question is, you've given a couple of examples of those that have done well in community crisis and those that haven't. But, if you were to sum up, what are the three most important things that we need to be focused on from a communications crisis perspective right now?
So I would think that, anticipating what can come next is the most important part. Like if it's a total surprise to you, then you'll be flat-footed and it will be hard to take control of the situation. So think ahead, right? So even if that's like when you're walking your dog around your neighborhood and you've not yet thought about what the next challenge to your business could be, do it, right? Just so then you're starting to wrap your head around the realities of your business environment. Then making a clear and decisive decision on what your next steps are and what's best for your business is the next thing, right? So that could mean, whatever that means in those scenarios. So going back to the Concord example, they knew that it was better in the long run for their business to keep their audience safe than and that they were willing to take the short-term hit on canceling their meetings, right? So making that decision and standing by it is really important. And then third, making sure that you are in regular communication with your audiences, right? Like this is good for business, period, right? And as a communicator in times of good and bad. So don't procrastinate on updating your email list, making sure your personal contacts are in order, making sure that things like social media and your website are well attended will help you in the long run. So for good and bad. So I would spend my time on those three things, and and then try to chip away at the others as time and resources permit.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Nell. Thank you, participants, for joining us today. I hope that you have learned as much as I have and really enjoyed this conversation and this presentation that Nell has shared with us. So thank you very much, and I wish you all a good day.
Yep. Thank you all. Thanks for having me today.